think Putin invaded Ukraine because of NATO? Think again. That's the official story: NATO expansion, denazification, defending Russian speakers. But none of those claims hold up to serious scrutiny. Western leaders like NATO Secretary General and former Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte say it's really about empire, that Ukraine was just the beginning, and that the Baltics, Poland, and Moldova could be next. But even that narrative only scratches the surface. The truth is deeper, older, and far more calculated than anyone expected. Because Russia's issues with Ukraine and NATO didn't start with Putin. They began decades ago, with a series of moves that almost no one recognized for what they really were. NATO was created in the aftermath of the Second World War. The intention was to place European nations under the protection of the US's military blanket, to allow them to rebuild and recover from the unprecedented destruction caused by the war, without interference from Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union. The US was by far the strongest military left standing after the war, and the only nation with nuclear weapons. But after having crushed Hitler's invasion of Russia and marching triumphantly into Berlin, the Soviets remained a powerful and belligerent threat, with de facto control over most of Eastern Europe. The original members, when NATO was established on April 4, 1949, were Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Greece and Turkey then joined in 1952, West Germany joined in 1955, and Spain in 1982. The rearmament of West Germany by NATO members in 1954 elicited strong protests from non-NATO Eastern European states, particularly Czechoslovakia and the Soviets. With the consequences of German militarism from the previous decade still fresh in the memory, they, understandably, feared a remilitarized West Germany. A series of discussions and meetings took place between NATO and the Soviets in 1954 about the proposed rearmament of West Germany and its incorporation into NATO. Among their proposals, the Soviets even went so far as to suggest that they should also join NATO, but this suggestion was rejected by the US. The Soviets also proposed that East and West Germany should be unified into a single, neutral state. However, the US insisted that a unified Germany should not be neutral and should be free to rearm and join the European Defence Community, or EDC, project being contemplated at the time. The EDC was ultimately never established. However, the Soviets concluded that since the NATO members had rearmed and incorporated West Germany in spite of their concerns, they would need a collective security arrangement of their own. Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov was concerned that NATO, inclusive of Germany, would sooner or later cast a more aggressive eye toward the USSR. And so, on May 14, 1955, the Warsaw Pact was signed by the USSR and 7 other Eastern European countries: Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, and Romania. An iron curtain went up between East and West. In a sense, Molotov's fears have become a self-fulfilling prophecy, with NATO's eye now fixed on the Soviets. And that's pretty much how the status quo remained until 1991, when the Soviet Union fell apart, and with it the Warsaw Pact. Ukraine, as one of the core Soviet socialist republics, had been a vital part of the Soviet system, which dominated the Warsaw Pact, and later emerged as a key protagonist in the USSR's collapse. In fact, Ukraine's declaration of state sovereignty on July 16, 1990 is considered by some historians to be as significant a moment in the fall of the Soviet Union as the iconic tearing down of the Berlin Wall the previous year. The Soviet Union had collapsed economically in the final years of the 1980s, and left with only bad options, Premier Mikhail Gorbachev began a series of reforms in an attempt to revitalize the system. But his policies, glasnost and perestroika, unleashed forces he could no longer control. What followed was a fraught period of negotiations, both internally between Moscow and the other Soviet republics, including Ukraine, and externally with the US and major European powers. Central to the discussions, once again, was Germany. The NATO powers wanted to reunify East and West Germany, with the unified nation retaining West Germany's membership of NATO. Western leaders began pitching to the Soviets to get them to buy into this plan, and assurances were given, verbally, on multiple occasions, that the reunification and future NATO activities wouldn't negatively affect Soviet interests in their sphere of influence. Much focus has been given to the US Secretary of State James Baker's verbal undertaking to Gorbachev that NATO wouldn't move 1 inch east, which has been disputed and discredited in many Ukrainian and Western circles. Many years later, in an interview, Gorbachev himself stated that the idea that firm commitments to this end had been given was a myth. However, declassified documents reveal that Western leaders were well aware that the issue of NATO expansion into former Warsaw Pact countries was a matter of great concern for the Soviets. And the documents also reveal that similar assurances were made by Baker, then President George Bush, West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, and others. There's little to suggest that at the time NATO was being dishonest, namely that it was in fact intending to expand into the former Soviet sphere of influence. The Cold War was finally ending, and peace was front of mind, not sources of potential future conflict. But that's not how it turned out, and today this supposed failure of NATO to honor its agreements is cited by Russia as a primary reason for its invasion of Ukraine. There are three problems with this story. Firstly, there were no written commitments given, as is clear from the declassified documents. There were discussions, suggestions, and even verbal assurances, but nothing was ever committed to paper. That means, legally, NATO has been well within its rights to expand wherever it wants without breaching any agreement with Russia. Secondly, all of these discussions were held and assurances given with respect to Soviet interests and sphere of influence, not Russian. When the Soviet Union dissolved, Russia legally inherited its interests, including the territory of the former Russian Soviet Republic, the Soviet military, and the USSR's permanent seat at the United Nations Security Council. However, a full 14 countries became independent states after the dissolution of the USSR in 1991. Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Estonia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and of course, Ukraine. So it's difficult to make the case that territorially, Soviet interests in 1990 equate to Russian interests 35 years later. Thirdly, although NATO has indeed expanded in leaps and bounds into former Warsaw Pact lands, in practically every case, this has been at the instigation of the individual countries, not NATO. In 1999, the first three former Warsaw Pact members joined NATO: the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland. In 2004, another 7 joined: Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. The 3 Baltic states remain the only former Soviet states to have joined. In 2009, following Russia's war with Georgia, Croatia and Albania became full NATO members. Montenegro followed them in 2017, and in 2020, North Macedonia became NATO's 30th member. Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Sweden and Finland both shed their long-standing neutral statuses and joined NATO in 2024 and 23, respectively. Now, of these nations, only the last 2 weren't previously definitively within the Soviet sphere of influence, either as Warsaw Pact members, Soviet republics, or parts of Yugoslavia. The Baltic states and Finland all share borders with Russia, so NATO already very much exists right on Russia's doorstep. And Russia didn't invade any of them after they joined NATO, though it did invade Georgia after the country expressed interest in joining. So isn't it blatant hypocritical nonsense for Russia to claim that Ukraine's proposed membership of NATO is a valid excuse to invade and lay waste to it? Well, frankly, yes it is, on many levels, but there are nuances. For starters, there are significant differences between the borders in question and how they relate to Russia's security equation. At 1,196.6 miles, Russia's border with Ukraine is by far the largest of its 4 NATO member neighbors. Its border with Finland is 830 miles long, Estonia 183 miles, Latvia 176.2, and Lithuania 165 miles long. So the border with Ukraine is significantly more difficult and costly to defend, as Ukraine's Kursk incursion in August 2024 so aptly demonstrated. Furthermore, Russia's borders with the Baltic states and Finland are all concentrated in Russia's far northwest, which is ring-fenced by the Arctic to the north and a controllable area to defend. Ukraine's borders, on the other hand, pass along much of the Russian heartland, within a few hundred miles of Moscow and other key centers like Kursk, Bryansk, and Rostov-on-Don. As has been demonstrated by Ukraine's ability to strike at key Western Russian industrial and military facilities with relative ease, the Ukrainian border exposes Russia's soft underbelly in ways the other borders never will. Also, while it's true that Russia didn't take any retaliatory military actions against former Warsaw Pact members and Soviet republics in response to their joining NATO, Russia's relationship with NATO has certainly deteriorated over the years. In the 1990s, post-Soviet Russia quickly became somewhat of a basket case, economically and politically. There was an attempted coup in 1991, followed by a constitutional crisis in 1993. Post-Soviet President Boris Yeltsin oversaw a decade of the strip mining of the former Soviet prized assets by domestic and international oligarchs. Against this backdrop, the former Warsaw Pact countries publicly expressed a desire to join NATO, as did many of the former Soviet republics, and found significant sympathy within NATO. Since the Soviet threat no longer existed, a weakened Russia alternately called for the elimination of NATO, due to its conversion from a military alliance to a political one and for Russian membership in the organization. NATO ignored them. When the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland were shortlisted for NATO membership, Russia protested loudly, but there wasn't much more they could do. Yeltsin couldn't stop these countries from joining NATO, but needed a way to quiet the growing dissent among the Russian political leadership. Eventually, a solution was found. On May 27, 1997, NATO and Russia signed a cooperation pact known as the NATO-Russia Founding Act. This agreement allowed Russia to have a consultative role within NATO discussions and provided the political cover Yeltsin needed to sell NATO's imminent expansion into Eastern Europe to the political elites back home. So, when NATO absorbed the first 10 former Soviet-controlled nations in 1999 and 2004, the whole process technically happened with Russia's involvement, though Moscow strongly opposed the expansion, with Yeltsin later calling it a forced step. However, things had started changing when Vladimir Putin came to power in 1999. Initially, he took a pro-Western stance and even reportedly asked Bill Clinton in 2000 about the possibilities of Russia joining NATO. But by 2007, his tone had changed considerably. In a now famous, or notorious, depending on how you look at it, speech at the Munich Security Conference in 2007, he warned that NATO's continued expansion eastwards was eroding Europe's security architecture and would result in a major conflict. He was particularly unimpressed by NATO's deliberations about inviting both Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. In 2008, William Burns, most recently the CIA director, but at the time the US ambassador to Russia, among others, advised against it. Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines for the Russian elite, not just Putin, Burns wrote. I have yet to find anyone who views Ukraine in NATO as anything other than a direct challenge to Russian interests. NATO policymakers ignored him, and at the 2008 Bucharest conference declared that Ukraine and Georgia would eventually become members, though neither was formally inducted into NATO's MAP program. And next thing you know, Russia was at war with Georgia. The conflict resulted in two provinces of Georgia, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, declaring independence, which is recognized by Russia and pretty much nobody else. Georgia and most of the world still consider the territory as Georgian, which is a crucial point when it comes to Georgia's possible admission to the NATO membership ranks. The NATO membership process requires countries to peacefully resolve international, ethnic, or external territorial disputes before they can join. So long as the two breakaway regions exist and are claimed by Georgia, Georgia, by de facto if not de jure, can't join NATO. From Putin's perspective, the problem is solved. Russia's invasion and annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the oblasts of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia pose an identical problem for Ukraine. If Putin's intention of invading these regions was to prevent Ukraine's admission to NATO, it's been an effective, if hugely bloody, costly, and completely unnecessary strategy. But there's more to it than that. Ukraine, along with Belarus, has much greater significance to Russia than any of its other former territories. Indeed, while the Ukrainian people have been actively trying to assert their sovereignty for centuries, to Putin and many other modern nationalists, Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia are more or less one and the same thing. Somewhat ironically, both visions can be traced to a significant extent to the Khmelnytsky uprising of 1648 to 1657 and the Pereyaslav Agreement of 1654 that resulted from it. Under the command of Hetman Bohdan Khmelnytsky, the Zaporizhian Cossacks, allied with the Crimean Tatars and the local Ukrainian peasantry, revolted against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The war, characterized by savage, mass atrocities on both sides, liberated the Ukrainian Orthodox population from subjugation and led to the establishment of a Cossack hetmanate in Ukraine. In this sense, it's regarded as a pivotal historical expression of Ukrainian national identity. However, the uprising also led to the eventual incorporation of eastern Ukraine into the Tsardom of Russia, initiated by the 1654 Pereyaslav Agreement. The agreement saw the Cossacks swear allegiance to the Tsar while retaining a wide degree of autonomy. However, right from the start, this was a match seemingly made in hell, at least from the Ukrainian perspective. A period of political turbulence and infighting in the hetmanate followed directly, known as the Ruin. These events eventually led to the full incorporation of the Cossack hetmanate into the Russian state, and by the 20th century, the Pereyaslav Agreement had become a celebrated event in Soviet history and philosophy, presented as the reunification of Ukraine with Russia. Ukraine had declared independence in 1917, seizing the opportunity in the chaos following the Bolshevik overthrow of the Tsars. A unified, independent Ukrainian state briefly emerged in 1919, before being subsumed again into the Soviet juggernaut. So Ukraine remained, however unwillingly, unified with Russia until independence in 1991. Regardless of the Ukrainian pursuit of sovereignty, the Soviets continued placing great value on the treaty throughout the Stalin and post-war era. The 300th anniversary celebrations of this reunification in 1954 were widespread in the Soviet Union and included a little event that would change the world 60 years later: the transfer of Crimea from the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. In 2014, Russia, of course, seized Crimea and annexed it back into the Russian Federation. What did that event have to do with Ukraine seeking NATO membership? Well, as with Georgia, the contested region makes it difficult for any decisive steps towards admitting Ukraine into NATO to be taken. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 certainly fulfills the same purpose, but is hardly necessary with the 2014 Crimea issue still ever so unresolved. Some might be able to forgive Putin for being wary of having NATO, with its Article 5 mutual defense clause, dug in all along that massive Ukrainian border of his. For all NATO's protestations about being a defensive alliance and posing no threat to Russia, the two parties have been antagonistic for decades, and NATO does have, by most estimates, a much greater military capacity than Russia. And its members' weapons have been killing its soldiers in Ukraine for most of the past 3 years. And for all President Trump's détente initiatives with Putin, the US's official policy towards Russia is to contain and weaken it. But he clearly didn't need to invade in order to stop Ukraine joining NATO. However unwarranted that may be. All else being equal, like all sovereign states, Ukraine should be free to join whatever alliances and treaties it decides to. So why did Putin invade? Was it just raw imperialism, a desire to implement the Territorial Agreement in full and reconquer Ukraine against the will of its people? Possibly. However, after his experience with the Chechens, it's unlikely that Putin has any desire to deal with a sustained, widespread insurgency carried out by an extremely capable population. That's exactly what's likely to happen in the improbable event that Russia is able to conquer Ukraine completely. Besides, absorbing all of Ukraine into Russia would be pushing his own border right into the heart of NATO, opening up a host of new hostile fronts. If Putin aims to keep NATO from his doorstep, then pushing his borders onto Poland, Hungary, Moldova, and Romania would be an act of spectacular self-sabotage. With that in mind, the simple tyrannical desire to conquer Ukraine seems too simplistic an explanation. Indeed, there are a host of strategic, ideological, and personal factors that are likely to have pushed Putin toward war, with resisting NATO expansion into Ukraine just one of them. Putin's ideological belief that Ukrainians and Russians are, in essence, one people, as laid out in his 2021 essay on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, is definitely a factor. Another is his legacy. Putin's rule has been built on restoring Russia's greatness. Losing Ukraine to the West would tarnish his historical image as the leader who reversed post-Soviet humiliation. Also, in the years preceding the invasion, the internal situation inside Russia had been gradually deteriorating, in no small part due to the sanctions imposed by the West following its annexation of Crimea. Like most nations, the global lockdown during COVID hurt the Russian economy, exacerbating the situation. By 2022, Putin faced stagnation, highlighted by falling living standards, protests over the imprisonment of opposition leader Alexei Navalny, and infighting among Russia's elites. A patriotic war could rally support and eliminate dissent. A high-stakes gamble to break the deadlock of Western pressure and sanctions. Plus, Putin had been watching with horror as Ukraine's military had grown from strength to strength, boosted by NATO training and high-tech weaponry like US Javelins and Turkish Bayraktar drones. By 2022, this was not the same army that had been forced to retreat from Debaltseve by Russian-backed Donbass separatists in 2015, prompting Ukraine to reluctantly sign the Minsk II Accords. He probably looked at the decrepit state of his own forces, ran the numbers, and concluded that there was a limited window of opportunity to act preemptively before any military advantage he had would be lost. So all things considered, it seems more likely that Putin's motives are a case of defensive imperialism rather than raw aggression, a war based on fear rather than greed, so to speak. The war certainly hasn't gone the way he planned it. Whether it results in Ukraine's admission to NATO down the line remains to be seen. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to stay updated for more deep dives into the stories behind the news. And thank you, as always, for watching.